I've now determined beyond the shadow of a doubt that we are in our final day of looking at the Old Testament allusions that are present in Matthew 24, verse 29, which reads thusly, Jesus speaking here, "Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken." There's so much more happening here than just a reference to some eclipses or comets or natural disasters. There are theological realities and theological themes and payoffs from the Old Testament that are occurring. And as we look at each of the points in the Old Testament that are being referenced subtly by Jesus in that verse I just read, I think you and I are getting a clearer and clearer picture of what the theological point is here and what not just Jesus is driving at, but all of history under the guidance of God is purportedly driving at. I'm going to have my friend Jeffrey play some music, and then we're going to keep working on this. And now, after looking at 5, 6 different passages, I think we can say pretty solidly that Jesus would not need to be referencing anything else in the Old Testament in order to get his point across here in Matthew 24, 29, because we totally get it. And it would be impossible to cram in any more meaning or references than that with so few words. But we would be wrong, because in Zephaniah 1:5, we get yet another prophecy that Jesus is clearly pointing back to. I'm going to start in verse 4. "I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all who live in Jerusalem. I will cut off from this place every remnant of Baal, the idol, the false god, the Canaanite deity, the names of the pagan and idolatrous priests, those who bow down on the roofs to worship the starry host, those who bow down and swear by the Lord, and also who swear by Molech, those who turn back from following the Lord and neither seek the Lord nor inquire of him." This one's a little more subtle, but did you catch it? The people who are adoring and worshiping and exalting the sky and finding their meaning and so forth, and the starry host and what's above, there's a correction, a cutting off that will happen for them, an indication that the things that humanity is placing false hope in will be dealt with and resolved. And I included that little detail, though the reference is more subtle, because I think for us, you got a few people who still look at the astrology page and think there's something to it. But for the most part, that's kind of quirk on the fringes of society. But at this point, one of the rival deities, the rival places to place your hope in comparison to the one true God, was in oracles, in the stars, in meaning, in effectively what I guess you would now call ancient paganism. And the Old Testament prophet Zephaniah is very much meant to be a swipe, a pushback, a calling out of that behavior on the parts of God's people under the corrupt kings Manasseh and Ammon. And it was a pull toward the deliverance, the religious transformation that happened under the good king Josiah a little bit later on. And at this point, I don't think I can probably fool you again by pretending that that's everything that Jesus came up with, because it's not. There's actually more. Isaiah 34, which is a chapter, a passage that deals with not an immediate judgment against one kingdom or another, but a future unfolding of things and how all of that tension is going to work out, says in verse 4, "All the stars of the heavens will be dissolved, and the sky rolled up like a scroll." You remember that one from singing songs? Like a scroll, whatever my lot. What is it? It is well with my soul. That's the song. "All the starry host will fall like withered leaves from the vine, like shriveled figs from the fig tree." And wow, that really works. The "it is well with my soul." I think I understand that song better right now, because it's not just talking about when I suffer or go through difficult times, which is what was going on for the author of that song. It's also talking about even when the fate of things is unfolding and the sign of the Son of Man appears and Christ returns and all of this dangerous unfolding and shaking of the world is going on, because I think the author of that song was saying, because my confidence is in Jesus, because I'm a kingdom citizen, that I would be able to say it's well with my soul, even as all of that is unfolding. Interesting. It's fun when we discover things together. Thank you for indulging me on that. At any rate, I think it could also be argued that Haggai 2 and verse 6 also includes some kind of illusion. Remember, Haggai is the book that involves Zerubbabel and the people who are rebuilding the temple under the edict of Cyrus the Great to send the Jewish people out of a captivity and back to go put things back together to build the second temple that eventually Herod would expand on, and that now in Matthew 24, Jesus is looking at from the Mount of Olives, giving this speech, this talk to his disciples, that place, even as that grand temple is being built, the prophet Haggai gives this little remark in chapter 2, verse 6. It says, "This is what the Lord Almighty says, in a little while I will once more shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake all nations, and the desired of all nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord Almighty. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine, declares the Lord Almighty. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty. And in this place I will grant peace, declares the Lord Almighty." We looked at this passage a few weeks ago, and now it would appear that Jesus is bringing us back around to look at this passage again, because even as the stability of the temple is being envisioned by Zerubbabel and his contemporaries in the late 6th century BC, and as they're going to rebuild this thing, even there, God is like, look, stuff is still going to shake. This is cool and all, but everything in it, like the money, the time, the unfolding of history, all of it belongs to the Lord. This building isn't ultimately the final point of everything. And know, even as you lay these stones and build this thing, that there are shakeups to come. And I think in light of what we're seeing in Matthew 24, we can safely say there are world kingdom shakeups. Like, this stuff's going to get crazy politically and whatnot, militarily and whatnot. But also there is still an unfolding of history, a shaking out of everything that is to come. Okay, how many episodes did we just use to do this? 3 just to get through one verse of Old Testament allusions. This is nuts what Jesus pulled off here. Look, all God, Christianity, faith, prophecy, like everything else aside, just from a literary perspective, this is masterful that he pulled on all of these threads, wove them together real quick sleight of hand, grabbed the rope and pulled on all those threads at once. And like, what is it even? Like 30 words in Matthew 24 and verse 29? It's insane how much he is able to accomplish so quickly. But if you just hung out with me for the last 3 days or whatever it's been, well, you're seeing it too. This isn't just a scatter shot back into history and let me just clamor and grab onto some things that sound important and kind of religious and stuff and use some turns of phrases you've heard before so it'll seem like I'm official. He deftly goes and grabs all of the dangling, flapping threads from prophecy and history in the Old Testament and the story of the Jewish people, and he grabs them all at once, only the right ones. He doesn't accidentally catch a few of those threads between his fingers that don't illustrate his point. He grabs all of those at once and pulls them forward with their meaning in like a sentence. And what is that meaning? Well, okay, he's drawing on gigantic nations that seem like our point of stability, falling and collapsing under the judgment of God, who is the true king of history, not governments, not kings, not emperors. All of these loose flapping threads that Jesus grabs onto and pulls forward in this remark also demonstrate a pattern by which God uses world kingdoms to judge his people, but then judges those world kingdoms and corrects them for what they're doing that is evil. But then there's the promise of deliverance in the end. It's like a disciplining parent. I got taken over the knee as a kid, and every single time that I got taken over the knee as a kid and swatted on the backside for doing something I shouldn't have done, the very next thing that happened after what were very gentle spankings in retrospect were my mom or my dad, who loved me, holding me as close as they could, giving me the tightest hugs that I maybe ever got and saying, I love you so, so, so much, and explaining that. Now, I know some of you don't discipline your kids that way. Cool. That's fine. We can agree to disagree on that. There might be a cultural shift going on that way right now. We'll see how history plays out and whether or not that cultural shift makes sense. Whatever, I got no judgment for anybody other than to say, in my experience, I was disciplined firmly by my parents at times when I was a kid, but it was always in the context of immediate restoration and a path forward for what we're going to do now, with their love for me never being in question. Even if that ain't how we do it at the moment, that is how we did it for a very, very long time in history. And that would have resonated as the role of a father, as the role of a good and loving and attentive parent to the original audience and to whom this was written in the first place. So we got the theme of the collapse of seemingly unmovable nations. We've got the theme of discipline and correction and restoration from God. And then that seems to project out into this being the payoff for all of those little moments in history where God disciplined and then corrected and then restored, and then the cycle starts again. This one seems to indicate that the cycle doesn't start again, that this is the big one. This is the one that is the overarching cycle for all of history that only cycles once, where humanity gets it wrong. We do evil things, and God puts bumpers on that and disciplines and restores and corrects. And yet there's this glimmer of hope. The glimmer of hope is Jesus of Nazareth, is the Son of God. It's God with us. It's the kingdom. It's the king. It's the kingdom values. It's the cross. It's the resurrection. It's life eternal. It's all the things that are being promised here through the life and words of Jesus. And that is the completion. That's the final historical restoration. And there isn't an indication that then after the Son of Man returns and everything gets straightened out, that then it all breaks again and we do it all again. Those little cycles of history all point to this one grand cycle, but the one grand cycle stands apart because it doesn't just keep rolling. There's actually an end game, and the end game is the redemption of God, the ultimate victory of the kingdom, the values of the kingdom, the visible, obvious reign of God, the realized role of servants of the king as agents and sons and daughters and heirs and inheritors of this kingdom. And so I am in awe of what Jesus just accomplished from a literary perspective. And then, as we just talked about here over the last minute or so, from a theological perspective in Matthew chapter 24, 29, because he so nimbly grabs all those threads and pulls them to a place where he communicates all that meaning that took me 4 episodes to get through with my clumsiness. And he does so in a way that in the midst of a conversation about a bunch of very scary things, it comes to this note of hope, and that the end game here is God's beautiful redemption of things and the realization of his beautiful, right, and glorious reign. One verse? Seriously, are you kidding me? If you like this kind of internet, you can help make it happen at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast, or you can also not, because it's the internet, you don't have to do anything. And I'm super happy that we get to hang out, whether you're into supporting things on the internet or not. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.